The first one knocked on her office door on a Monday morning in April. His name was David Kellner. He was 51 years old, 17 years at Callaway Group. And he stood in the doorway of the office that, 9 months ago, he had told the company's VP of Human Resources she was not qualified to occupy, with the particular body language of a man who has understood, recently and completely, that the ground has shifted under him in a way he cannot undo. He asked if she had a few minutes. Priya Anand sighed. Yes. Come in. She did not perform graciousness or ice. She was direct and professional, and she had her laptop open and a notepad beside it. And she said, come in the way you said when you were running a department, and someone on your team needs a conversación, and there are 12 other things on the calendar that day, because David Kellner was on her team now. He sat down across from her, and they talked through the Q2 project timeline that had been his area of ownership for the previous 4 years and was now being integrated into the division she ran. And she asked the right questions and listened to the right answers and gave him the direction he needed. And he left 40 minutes later with a clarity about his work that, he would admit to his wife that evening, he had not fully expected. He had expected, if he was honest, something else. He did not say what. She knew what. Go back 18 months. Priya Anand had joined Callaway Group 6 years before the promotion decision. She had come in as a senior analyst, been promoted to manager after 2 years on the basis of performance reviews that used words like exceptional and unprecedented in contexts that were neither hyperbolic nor routine. And had spent the following 4 years building the analytics division's institutional knowledge base from a collection of legacy processes that barely communicated with each other into a coherent, operational infrastructure that the company's leadership had cited in 2 consecutive annual reports as a competitive differentiator. The specific work she had done was not glamorous in the way that certain visible corporate achievements are glamorous. It was the kind of work that is invisible until it is absent. The documented process architecture, the cross-functional data protocols, the reporting frameworks that allow the division's output to be legible to client-facing teams who did not speak the underlying technical language. She had built a team that trusted its own methodology because the methodology was clear and defensible. She had built relationships across the organization because she had taken the time, repeatedly and without being asked, to understand how other divisions use the analytics division's output and to adjust that output accordingly. She had also, in year 4, led a client engagement that the company's CEO had described in the board report as demonstrating the division's capabilities at a level the firm had not previously achieved publicly. She had not been named in the board report. The division had been named. She had noted this without bitterness and without surprise, because she had been in professional environments long enough to understand how credit distributes in organizations that have not built systems for distributing it accurately. She had applied for the VP role with 6 years of documented performance and a record that objectively assessed was stronger than any other candidates in the pool. The 3 senior managers who moved against her had not worked closely with her in years. They had each been in cross-functional contact, and in each of those contacts, the dynamic had followed a similar pattern. Priya produced work that was precise and effective, received it as matter of course, and moved on. While the manager in question developed over time a sense that their own relative standing in the organization was illuminated unfavorably by the comparison. This was not a feeling they had examined consciously or named clearly. It was the kind of ambient professional discomfort that people convert into assessments of the person producing it, into phrases like hard to align with and not executive ready and stakeholder relationship concerns, without understanding, or perhaps while choosing not to understand, that the assessment is not of the person, but of their own discomfort. David Kellner had said, hard to align with, in a calibration meeting that was officially for performance feedback but was, practically, a forum in which the views of senior managers about rising talent shaped compensation and promotion decisions before those decisions were formally processed. Beth Sorensen had said, not executive ready, in a leadership development conversation with the CHRO that was designed to identify gaps and plan developmental support, but that also in practice functioned as a soft veto channel for people with access to it. Mark Aldridge had raised stakeholder relationship concerns in a direct conversation with the CEO that he had initiated himself, a conversation that by his account to Beth and David afterward had been received with more seriousness than he had anticipated. They had not coordinated. There had been no meeting, no message thread, no agreed language. There had been something more organic and in some ways more difficult to name. A shared orientation, an understood direction, the kind of alignment that does not need to be spoken because the people involved already know what they are doing. Tres vague concerns from three different senior voices, raised in three different private conversations, in the same 4-week window before the decision. The cumulative effect was a fog that settled over the most qualified candidate's record in exactly the way fog is designed to settle, without a visible source, obscuring the landscape, leaving people to navigate by a different kind of visibility. Christopher Hale had been visible in the way the fog permitted. Priya had read her rejection notification in her car in the company parking garage. She had been in her manager's office when the CHRO delivered the news in person. She had been told it was coming, not by official advance notice, but by the specific texture of the previous 2 weeks, the way certain colleagues had stopped mentioning the role in conversation around her, the way the CHR's calendar request had been worded. She had known before she sat down. The CHRO had been kind in the way of someone who understood that the outcome was not defensible and was trying to absorb the discomfort of delivering it without asking the recipient to help absorb it. She had said the right things about Priya's contributions and her future at the company and the strength of her record. Priya had thanked her and left. She had sat in the car for a long time. The parking garage was the kind of place where being alone is easy. Concrete, fluorescent lit, the ambient sound of distant ventilation, and occasional other cars. She was not processing grief. She was processing information and deciding what to do with it. She had two clear options. She could stay and continue building the record that would eventually, on the company's timeline, produce the recognition it had been deferring. This option required trusting that the conditions would change, that the people who had shaped this decision would not be in a position to shape the next one, or that the accumulated weight of her record would eventually be undeniable enough that no amount of informal lateral conversation could obscure it. The other option was to take the record to a place that would receive it correctly, without requiring her to wait for conditions to change. She sat in the parking garage and thought about both options with the same methodical attention she brought to any complex decision. Then she drove home. That evening, she updated her resume for the first time in 4 years. The update took 45 minutes because the material was there and she knew exactly what it said. She called a former colleague the next morning. Callaway Group's leadership did not know, when Priya began her external job search, that they were in a race they were losing. They also did not know, until 3 months after the promotion decision, about the conversation that had shaped it. The conversation came to light because Beth Sorensen had mentioned it to a colleague who told another colleague who mentioned it to a member of Priya's team. Not maliciously, not strategically, but in the way that information moves in organizations when people talk about things they assume are already known. The colleague who ultimately passed the information to someone on Priya's team had assumed, incorrectly, that everyone already knew. Priya learned what had been said about her, the specific phrases, who had said them, the context in which they had been raised, on a Wednesday afternoon from her team lead, who delivered the information with the tense discomfort of someone carrying something they did not want to carry and did not know what to do with. Priya listened to all of it. She thanked him. She told him she was going to need a day. She took the day. She verified what she could verify, cross-referencing the account with the timing of events she already knew, identifying which parts of what she had been told were consistent with documented facts. Most of it was consistent. The shape of it was clear. She did not go to HR. She had thought about this carefully, and she had concluded that going to HR with an account of informal lateral conversations that had shaped a promotion decision was not a process likely to produce a result proportional to the harm, at least not on a timeline that served her. What she had decided was this: she was going to use the energy she might have spent on a complaint to finish getting out. She accepted an offer from Meridian Analytics 9 weeks after learning what had been done. Meridian was a direct competitor, larger by 200 employees, more technically sophisticated in its data infrastructure, with a VP of Analytics role that had been open for a month because the previous holder had been recruited to a tech company and had taken 2 of his direct reports with him on the way out. Priya had impressed the interview panel at Meridian in the way she impressed every room she entered with the full weight of her preparation. not by performing confidence, but by demonstrating, in specific and verifiable terms, exactly what she had built and exactly how she had built it and exactly what she intended to build next. She had received the offer 11 days after the first interview. She had negotiated for an additional 3 days and had used those 3 days to verify 2 references and think carefully about what she was walking into. She joined Meridian as vice president of analytics. Her compensation increased by 31%. Her first 4 months at Meridian were the professional version of what happens when a person who has been operating below their natural capacity is given the resources and the scope that match what they can actually do. The systems she built in those 4 months used the full framework she had developed at Callaway, refined, improved by the new infrastructure, adapted to a larger and more complex organizational context. Her team responded to her with the focused engagement of people who had been managed with unclear expectations before and were now being managed with clarity. 2 client presentations she led in her second month produced, according to Meridian's CEO's assessment at the quarterly leadership review, the best capability demonstrations the firm had made in 2 years. The CEO of Meridian had described her, at a board meeting she was not present at, as the best hire the company had made in 3 years. The CEO of Callaway Group had heard this indirectly through the professional network that connects senior executives at competing firms in ways they do not always acknowledge. It had also, by that point, been living with the results of his own decision for 7 months. It called Priya on a Wednesday afternoon. She took the call in her office. She knew who it was before she picked up. His assistant had sent the calendar request. And she had thought about how to handle it with the same deliberate attention she brought to every decision that had professional consequence. She had decided to take the call and to be direct and to listen to everything he said before deciding what her answer was going to be. Because she was a professional and because the conversation might contain information that was useful regardless of the outcome. Alan Greer laid out the offer in full. He did not minimize what had happened. He acknowledged in language that was not quite an apology but was adjacent to one, that the previous promotion process had not produced the right outcome and that the costs of that outcome had become visible in the performance of the division in the months since. Aside, the Chief Analytics Officer role was a new creation, that it reported directly to him and that he was asking her because she was the right person for it. She told him she needed a week. She took the week. She thought about the people she respected and asked 2 of them for their read. She thought about what she was building at Meridian and what leaving it would mean for the team she had assembled. She thought, without dwelling, about the 3 managers whose names she had learned on a Wednesday afternoon from her team lead, and she thought about what it meant that the structure of the new role at Callaway would place their teams under her oversight. She had decided this was not a reason to decline. The structure was the right structure for the scope of the work. The reporting lines followed the organizational logic. The fact that it happened to include 3 specific people was not the reason for the structure and was not a sufficient reason to decline. She accepted. She negotiated the title, the compensation, the reporting structure, and the scope. She negotiated one other thing, a written commitment, incorporated into her employment agreement. That the reporting structure would include direct oversight of all 3 divisions whose scope fell within the Chief Analytics Officer's mandate, which meant David Kellner, Beth Sorensen, and Mark Aldridge all reported to her. Alan Greer had structured it this way because the work required it. She had accepted it because the work required it. The fact that the 3 of them happened to be in the structure was, in the end, the most accurate version of the outcome their actions had created, not designed as punishment. Boot arrived at as the natural consequence of the organization correcting a decision that had been wrong. But let me describe what happened at Callaway Group in the 9 months between Priya's departure and Alan Greer's call, because that sequence is the context that explains why he called. Christopher Hale's tenure as VP of Analytics lasted 7 months, not 7 dramatic months. No scandal, no public failure, nothing that would have made a headline. The quieter, more consequential kind of professional difficulty that occurs when someone is placed in a role that requires specific institutional knowledge they have not built, in a division whose infrastructure was built by someone else who is no longer available to interpret or maintain it. The systems Priya had built were documented. The documentation was thorough. Both documentation of a system and the ability to operate develop, and defend that system under real conditions are not the same thing. A process manual describes what should happen. It does not contain the judgment that produced the process, the relationships that sustain it, or the ability to adapt it when conditions change. Callaway Group spent 7 months discovering the distance between the manual and the person. Client satisfaction scores in the analytics division declined in the first 2 quarters after Priya left. 2 key accounts raised concerns in writing. One about responsiveness, one about the quality of the analytical output on a project that had previously been a showcase engagement. An internal review identified process gaps that the previous year's efficiency metrics had not shown, because the processes that prevented those gaps had been maintained by someone who was no longer there. Christopher was not incompetent. He was a capable profesional who had been placed by people who had confused surface confidence for substantive readiness in a role that required capabilities he had not developed. The failure was not his. It was the decision that preceded him. Alan Greer had reviewed the performance data in September. He had the conversation with the CHRO that led to the conversation with the talent advisor that led to the call. He was, by his own reputation, slow to acknowledge mistakes and thorough in fixing them once he did. He had reached the acknowledgement stage. He called Priya. The analytics division's client satisfaction scores were the highest they had been in 4 years. The business intelligence division had been integrated into a unified data strategy framework that Priya had designed in her first 3 months and implemented with the assistance of a team that had, in her assessment, been underutilized and underdirected for years. 3 new client accounts had been won on the strength of capabilities presentations she had led. David Kellner had adjusted, not immediately. The first 3 months had been tense, in the specific way of a professional relationship that begins with an unspoken history neither party has formally acknowledged. Buthe was skilled at his work, and he was not incapable of learning. And what he had learned, in 4 months of working inside a team that Priya ran, was the difference between being in a department that was managed well and being in one that was managed exceptionally. He did not articulate this. He showed it in his work, which improved. Beth Sorensen had been more resistant, in the way of someone whose sense of her own standing required a longer recalibration. There had been a specific conversation in month 4 that Priya had initiated because the resistance had become something that was affecting the team rather than just the individual relationship, and which Priya had conducted with the direct, non-punitive clarity of a manager who understands that the goal is the work and that the work requires the person to be functional. Beth had been functional after that conversation. Not warm, funcional. Priya had accepted this as the correct outcome. Mark Aldridge had surprised her. He had come to her at the end of the first month and said, with the slightly stilted quality of someone saying something they have been rehearsing, that he wanted to be useful to what she was building and that he was prepared to put the previous year behind them if she was. She had said she appreciated that and had given him a project that used what he was good at and that he had delivered well. She had given him 2 more after that. She had concluded by month 6, someone who performed better under clear direction and clear expectations than he had under the ambiguous culture he had been operating in before she arrived, and that his behavior in the promotion process had been at least partly the product of an environment that had not held people accountable for it. She did not forgive the 3 of them, in the sense of releasing the knowledge of what they had done. She carried it the way she carried most uncomfortable truths, clearly, without drama, as information about the world that was true and that she had chosen not to be defined by. What she was defined by was the work. The work had always been the answer. It had been the answer when she built the infrastructure at Callaway the first time. It had been the answer when she accepted the Meridian offer and outperformed what the role required in 4 months. It had been the answer when she came back and built the larger thing with the wider scope. It was still the answer on a Monday morning in April when David Kellner knocked on her door and asked if she had a few minutes. And she said yes. Come in. And they talked through the work for 40 minutes, and he left with the clarity he needed. She opened her laptop. She had 12 other things on the calendar. She started with the first one, because that was what you did when the work was the answer. You started with the next thing, and then the one after that. And you let the record build the way records build When someone keeps showing up and doing the work correctly. She had been doing it for 6 years at the first company. She had been doing it for 4 months at the second. She was going to keep doing it at the third. The work was always the answer. It always had been.